My name is William, and I'm 41 years old. I make furniture by hand in a one-man shop outside Asheville, and a friend talked me into trying a singles mixer downtown on a Friday night. The format was speed dating. 3 minutes per round, a bell between each one, and I sat through 4 rounds of polite small talk that didn't feel like anything. Then the host pointed me toward table 7, and the woman sitting there was 15 years older than me. I almost asked for a different table, but then she looked up at me and smiled, and something shifted before I could think about it. The shop sits behind my house, a rented place with a porch that sags on the left side and a yard that grows more weeds than grass. I built it myself from 2x4s and plywood. The roof doesn't leak much, and the door sticks when the humidity rises. Inside, there's a workbench I made from a slab of white oak, a table saw older than I am, and shelves of cherry and walnut boards stacked by grain and color. Dust gets into everything. My clothes, my truck, the creases of my hands, though most days I don't notice it anymore. I came to furniture the way I came to most things, through accident and someone else's patience. A man named Gerald, who lived 3 properties down, took me on when I was 17. Not because I showed promise, but because I showed up every morning and didn't complain about splinters. He taught me to read grain, to listen for the sound a board makes when it's dry enough to work, to sand with the grain instead of against it. He died 8 years ago. I still catch myself turning to ask him something when a joint won't come together right. The divorce was 3 years back. Claire and I didn't fight or throw things or lawyer up and carve each other to pieces. We just ran out of things to say, the way a well runs dry in a drought nobody noticed starting. She moved to Raleigh to be closer to her sister, and I kept the house and the shop and the quiet that came with them. Some nights the quiet felt like relief, and some nights it felt like something I didn't have a name for. Most evenings I eat leftovers standing at the workbench while I study whatever I'm building, then sit on the porch with a beer and watch the light go down behind the tree line. The phone doesn't ring much after 8, and I've gotten used to the shape of my own quiet, the way it fills a room without asking. I'm not lonely in the way people mean when they say the word like it's something you catch. I'm just a man who lives alone and has mostly made his peace with it, except for the nights when the peace feels thinner than usual, and the house sounds like it's holding its breath. Marcus is the one who got me into this. He's been married to Deb for 12 years, has 2 kids, coaches Little League on Saturdays, and believes with the full force of his personality that every single man he knows should be dating. He started bringing it up at breakfast at the hardware store in the middle of helping me lift a dresser into a client's living room. He'd say I needed to get back out there, the way he says everything, like it's already decided and I just haven't caught up yet. The mixer was at a restaurant called the Hawthorne, downtown on a street I don't drive often. Marcus found it online, bought my ticket before I said yes, and texted me the confirmation with a thumbs up and the words, "No excuses." I almost texted back that furniture doesn't make itself, and I had a cherry dining table with a warped leaf that needed planing. But he looked at my hands, saw the dust under the nails, and thought maybe Marcus had a point about getting out of the shop. The drive into town took 20 minutes on a road that winds through the hills. My truck smelled like walnut shavings and the old leather of the seat, and I'd put on a clean flannel shirt, the one I saved for deliveries. I could still feel sawdust in the creases of my neck no matter how hard I scrubbed in the shower. The sun was going down behind the mountains, and the trees along the road were starting to turn. Just the first hints of orange at the edges. I don't remember deciding to go. I just remember the truck turning onto the downtown street and seeing string lights through a restaurant window and thinking I should have stayed home. I parked in a lot behind the restaurant and sat in the truck for a few minutes with the engine ticking as it cooled. A couple walked past on the sidewalk, the woman laughing at something the man said, his hand resting on her back like it belonged there. I tried to remember the last time I'd touched someone that way, casually, without thinking about it, and the answer came back slower than I wanted it to. 3 years is a long time to go without your hands knowing where to go. When Marcus first brought up the mixer, I told him I wasn't looking for anything. He said nobody ever is, which is the kind of thing Marcus says that sounds dumb until you think about it for a day and realize he might be right. I didn't think I was looking. Sitting in my truck behind the Hawthorne with sawdust still in my knuckles and a clean shirt that didn't feel like mine. But I'd driven 20 minutes into town on a Friday night, and that meant something whether I wanted it to or not. I locked the truck and walked around to the front entrance. The Hawthorne had a patio with string lights and a host stand inside the door, and a woman with a clipboard and a lanyard checked my name off a list and pointed toward a private room in the back. She smiled the way people smile when they're being friendly for a job, and I smiled back the way I smile when I'm trying not to look as uncomfortable as I feel. The music from the main dining room followed me halfway down the hall before it faded into the sound of 30 people trying to sound interesting in a room that smelled like candles and white wine. I stood in the doorway for a second and took the room in. Round tables with white tablecloths, each one set for two, with a number card in the center and a small candle that flickered every time someone walked past. A bar along the back wall where a few people were already drinking and laughing louder than the room warranted. More women than men, which I hadn't expected. And most of them looked like they knew what they were doing in a way I definitely didn't. A woman in a black blazer stepped up to a small microphone at the front of the room. She introduced herself as the host. She walked us through the format with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 100 times. The women would stay seated, and the men would rotate after each round. 3 minutes per date, a bell to signal the end, and a couple of minutes between rounds to mark your scorecard and make notes. At the end of the speed dating rounds, there would be a cocktail mixer with no timer and no rotation, just free time to talk to whoever you wanted. She handed out name tags and scorecards as we filed past her table. The name tag was a sticky rectangle with my name printed on it in blocky letters, and I pinned it to my flannel shirt crooked because I couldn't see the mirror behind the woman's head. The scorecard had a grid with table numbers down the side and 2 columns labeled yes and no, with a thin line for notes beside each one. I folded it into a triangle under the table, then unfolded it and smoothed it flat against my thigh. I looked around at the other men as they found their starting tables. Some of them moved through the room with the easy confidence of guys who do this kind of thing on weekends, shaking hands, making jokes, already comfortable in their skin. A few others looked like me, stiff in chairs they didn't choose, checking their phones for something to do with their hands. One guy near the bar was wearing a suit that fit him like he'd been born in it, and I thought of my own flannel shirt and the sawdust I could still feel in the seams. A woman at the bar laughed too loud at something, tilting her head back and touching the arm of the man next to her, and I wondered if this was what trying looked like from the outside. I couldn't tell if she was having fun or performing having fun, and the fact that I couldn't tell made me feel like I was in the wrong room for the wrong reasons. I thought about the cherry table in my shop, the warped leaf, the planing I could be doing right now, and the thought was warm and familiar and safe. The host rang a small brass bell and told us to find our starting tables. I pulled out my scorecard, checked the number she'd assigned me, and walked to table 3 with my hands in my pockets and my heart doing something it doesn't usually do on a Friday night. The woman, already seated there, looked up at me with polite expectation, and I sat down and tried to think of something to say that didn't sound like I'd practiced it in the truck. The candle on the table flickered between us, and the host set a timer on her phone, and the first round began. The first woman was named Amy, 33, and she worked in marketing for a company that made outdoor gear. She had a nice smile and good posture. She asked what I did for a living like she was checking items off a list. When I said I made furniture, her smile held, but her eyes moved past my shoulder to the man at the next table, and she pivoted to a story about a trip to Colorado that she'd clearly told before. I nodded in the right places and watched the timer on the host's phone count down from 3 minutes, and when the bell rang, Amy stood up and said it was nice meeting me in the same tone she might use to say the restroom was down the hall. The second woman was Rachel, 38, and she sold real estate on the east side of town. She talked about the market for the full 3 minutes without asking me a single question, and I learned that inventory was low and interest rates were stabilizing, and she'd just closed on a 4-bedroom with a mountain view that she was very proud of. When the bell rang, she was mid-sentence about a granite countertop, and she stood up and walked to the bar without saying goodbye. I wrote the word talker on my scorecard and moved to the next table. The third woman was younger, maybe 29, and I could tell from the way her eyes dropped to my hands before they reached my face that she'd already made her decision. My hands are rough and calloused, the nails cut short, a scar across the left thumb from a chisel slip 6 years ago that never healed clean. She asked what I did. I said furniture, and something in her expression closed like a door swinging shut on a quiet hallway. She spent the next 2 minutes telling me about her job at a tech startup and checking the door every few seconds like she was looking for someone better to appear. When the bell rang, she didn't even say anything. She just picked up her wine glass and looked past me toward the next table. I sat there looking at the empty chair across from me and noticed the candle had burned down to the glass, the flame guttering in a pool of its own wax. 3 rounds down, and the evening already felt like a board I'd cut wrong and couldn't figure out how to fix. By the 4th round, I'd stopped trying to make the conversations feel like anything. A woman named Grace asked about my income within the first 30 seconds, and another woman named Heather talked about her cats the way people talk about their children, and I sat there with my scorecard filling up with one-word notes that I hoped were kind enough not to hurt anyone's feelings. None of it felt wrong or bad. It just felt like going through the motions in a room where nobody was looking for what I was looking for, even though I couldn't have told you what that was if someone had asked me right then. Between rounds, the host gave us 2 minutes to write notes and catch our breath, and I used the time to look at the cherry grain pattern on the table surface. It was a cheap table, not solid wood, just a veneer over particle board. But the grain pattern was still real, still something that had grown in a forest and been cut and dried and pressed thin. I traced it with my finger and thought about the slab I had in the shop, the one I'd been saving for 2 years for the right project, the way the grain curled at one end like a wave frozen mid-break. The bell rang for the 5th round and the host called out the table assignments. She pointed me toward Table 7 on the far side of the room near the patio door, and I picked up my scorecard and my beer and walked over with the same flat energy I'd been carrying all night. I rounded the partition that separated Table 7 from the rest of the room, and I saw her for the first time, and my feet slowed before my brain caught up to why. She was sitting with her hands folded on the tablecloth, not checking her phone, not adjusting her posture, not looking around the room for someone better. She was just present, the way a person is when they're comfortable being exactly where they are. Her hair was dark brown with silver threading through it, not dyed or hidden, just there the way wood shows its age in the grain if you don't sand it away. She wore a simple black blouse with small gold studs in her ears and no other jewelry, and her face had the kind of lines that come from years of squinting in sunlight and laughing with her whole mouth. Nothing about her asked for attention. I did the math without meaning to. She was older than me. Clearly older, maybe 15 years, maybe more. The age gap sat between us like a fact on a table, and for half a second I considered turning around and asking the host for a different table, not because she looked wrong or bad, but because I didn't know what I was supposed to do with the distance between her age and mine in a room built for 3-minute conversations. Then she looked up at me and smiled, and the temperature of the room changed. It wasn't a bright smile or a practiced one. Not the kind that asks for something or offers too much. It was steady and calm. The kind of smile that says, I see you and I don't need anything from you and you can sit down if you want to. Something in my chest shifted before my head could catch up to it. A feeling I didn't have a name for and hadn't felt in long enough that I had forgotten what it weighed. I sat down and set my scorecard on the table without looking at it. For the first time all night, I didn't know what to say. It was a different kind of not knowing. The other rounds had been not knowing how to sound interesting, and this was not knowing how to sound honest. She watched me settle into the chair with those dark eyes that missed nothing. And I got the sense she already knew what I was thinking about the age gap and had decided it wasn't her problem. She spoke first. She told me her name was Eleanor. She was 56 and she designed gardens for a living. Then she asked what I made, and when I said furniture, something in her expression changed. Not impressed and not performing interest, but genuinely curious, the way someone looks at a thing they actually want to understand. Eleanor leaned forward half an inch and asked what kind, and when I said cherry and walnut, she nodded like she knew the difference between them. Nobody had asked me a follow-up question all night. Amy had changed the subject. Rachel had talked over me, the younger woman had checked out, and Grace had asked about my income. But Eleanor leaned forward and asked me about wood. And the question was so simple and so specific that it opened a door I didn't know was closed. I told her about the cherry dining table with the warped leaf. And she listened with her whole body turned toward me. And the 3 minutes on the host's timer started to feel like the shortest 3 minutes I'd ever sat through. The conversation didn't feel like the other rounds. There was no performance in it. No checking the door, no waiting for the next person to rotate in. Eleanor asked questions like she actually wanted the answers. And when she answered mine, she didn't hedge or soften or wrap her words in packaging. She told me she'd started her garden design business at 43 after a divorce that took 20 years to end. And she said it the way I would tell someone about a board that split during drying, just a fact about something that happened and what came after. She told me she'd spent 15 years working at a garden center for someone else, learning the trade by doing it, watching what survived and what didn't. And one day she realized she'd been building someone else's business the way she could have been building her own. So she left and started taking clients out of her truck with a sketch pad and a spade, and now she had a crew of 3 and more work than she could handle. She told me this without bragging, the way a person tells you about their day, and I could hear the years of work underneath every sentence. I noticed she didn't flinch when she talked about the hard parts. The divorce wasn't dressed up as a tragedy or a triumph, just something she walked through and came out the other side of. There was no weight in her voice when she said 20 years, no performance of pain or strength, just the plain fact of it sitting on the table between us like a piece of wood you've sanded smooth enough that it doesn't catch your hand anymore. I'd spent 3 years not talking about my own divorce because I didn't know how to hold it. And here she was, holding hers with one hand, like it was just another thing she'd built. I forgot about the scorecard in my hand. I forgot about the timer on the host's phone. I forgot that we were in a room with 28 other people who were all performing versions of themselves for 3 minutes at a time. There was just this woman across the table from me with soil under her nails that she hadn't quite cleaned, asking me about grain patterns and listening to the answers like they mattered. She asked me how I learned the trade, and I told her about Gerald. He was the old man who took me on at 17 and taught me to read wood the way you read a person by looking at what's underneath the surface. She smiled when I said that. Not a big smile, just a small turn at the corner of her mouth that said she understood what I meant. She told me she'd learned the same way from a woman named Ruth who ran the garden center and who could look at a patch of clay and tell you what would grow in it before she turned the first shovel. We talked about the difference between building something to last and building something to sell, and she said something that stuck in my chest like a splinter I couldn't pull out. She said people don't know the difference because they've never built anything with their hands. They buy and they sell and they move on, and they never feel the weight of a thing they made sitting in someone else's house, holding someone else's dinner, standing in someone else's garden. She said it without judgment, just observation. The way a carpenter looks at a joint that's been glued instead of dovetailed and notes the difference without needing to say which one is wrong. I asked her about the divorce then, the thing I hadn't asked any of the other women because none of them had felt safe enough to hear the answer. I told her mine wasn't ugly, just empty, that two people can run out of things to say to each other without anyone being at fault, the way a river can dry up without anyone stealing the water. Claire didn't do anything wrong, and neither did I. We just stopped being the people we were when we started, and neither of us knew how to say that out loud until it was too late to fix it. Eleanor listened to all of it without interrupting. Her hands stayed folded on the table and her eyes stayed steady on mine. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said hers was similar but different. She said for 20 years she'd been the person her husband needed. The one who kept the house and the schedule and the peace, and somewhere along the way, she stopped being the person he chose and started being the person he relied on. She said there's a difference between being needed and being chosen, and most people don't figure out which one they are until the needing stops and the choosing doesn't come back. That line landed somewhere behind my ribs and sat there. I didn't respond right away because I didn't have anything to say that was big enough for it. I thought about Claire, about the last year of our marriage, how I'd felt needed but not chosen, and how I'd never found the words for that because it sounded ungrateful even inside my own head. Eleanor had found the words, and she'd said them plainly like she'd carried them around long enough to know their exact weight and shape. I looked down at her hands on the table and noticed them properly for the first time. They were rough, rougher than I had expected, with calluses across the palms and soil under the nails that no amount of scrubbing had quite reached. She built things too. She turned earth and stone and plants into something people lived inside of, and her hands showed it the same way mine did. I'd spent the whole night feeling like my hands didn't belong in this room. And here was a woman whose hands looked like they'd been in the same dirt I'd been in, just a different kind. The bell rang and the sound cut through the room like a saw through a clean board. I hadn't written a single word on my scorecard for Table 7. I hadn't thought about the timer or the rotation or any of the mechanics of the evening for the last 3 minutes. Eleanor looked at me across the table and told me she'd enjoyed talking to me. And her voice was the same steady voice she'd used the whole time. And I couldn't tell if she felt what I felt or if she was just being kind. I stood up and said something about hoping to talk more at the mixer, and she nodded, and I walked to the next table carrying the weight of a conversation I didn't want to leave. The next table held a woman named Megan, 35, who worked in human resources at a hospital, and I couldn't focus on a single word she said. She was telling me about her weekend plans, something about a hike and a brunch, and her mouth was moving and sounds were coming out, but my eyes kept drifting past her shoulder to Table 7. A younger man had sat down across from Eleanor, maybe 30, maybe less, and he was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed and checking his phone while she talked. She was mid-sentence, gesturing with one hand like she had when she told me about her first garden, and he wasn't listening to a word of it. Something tightened in my jaw. I didn't know her, not really, not beyond a 3-minute conversation about wood and gardens and the difference between being needed and being chosen. But watching that man not listen to her felt like watching someone set a chair leg in crooked and call it fine. You don't have to know a piece of furniture to know when someone's treating the wood wrong. Megan asked me a question and I pulled my attention back to her and answered something about hiking that I don't remember saying. She was perfectly nice, the kind of woman who would be easy to like on a different night, in a different room, when I wasn't carrying the shape of another conversation in my chest. The bell rang and she smiled and said good luck, and I moved to the next table with my scorecard folded in my hand and my focus still across the room. The rounds kept coming and I kept rotating, and each one blurred into the next like grain patterns on boards you've seen too many times to tell apart. A woman who loved hiking and wanted to talk about elevation gain. A woman who asked what kind of car I drove and lost interest when I said a pickup. A woman who told me about her cat for 3 minutes straight while I nodded and thought about Eleanor's hands, the soil under her nails, how she held her own story without flinching. Between rounds, I watched Eleanor across the room. She sat with each new partner the same way she'd sat with me, present and patient, not performing, just there. One man rotated away from her looking confused, like he'd been handed something he didn't know what to do with and wasn't sure if he should put it down or keep holding it. Another man leaned forward the way I had, interested, asking questions. And something in my chest tightened when I saw it. A feeling I recognized as jealousy, even though I had no right to it after 3 minutes and one conversation. But 3 minutes was enough. I know what real feels like. The way I know when a board is dry enough to work, not because someone told me, but because something in my hands recognizes the weight of it. Eleanor's words stayed with me. About being the person someone needed instead of the person someone chose. I turned it over in my head while a woman named Brittany told me about her CrossFit routine, and I realized I'd been doing the same thing Claire and I had done. I'd been choosing women who needed something from me, a steady income, a fixer, someone reliable, instead of looking for someone who saw me the way Eleanor had seen me in 3 minutes, like I was worth understanding. My scorecard had names on it from every table, but only one had anything written next to it, and the note was too long for the thin line they'd given us. I'd written the word steady and then tried to write something else and run out of space, and I'd folded the card over to make more room and then given up because the thing I wanted to write wasn't going to fit on a scorecard. The host rang the bell one last time and announced that the speed dating rounds were over and the cocktail mixer would begin. She said we could move freely around the room, talk to whoever we wanted. No timer, no rotation, no bell. The room shifted as people stood up and stretched and migrated toward the bar, and I stood at my last table with my scorecard in my hand and scanned the room for dark brown hair with silver threading through it. I found her standing near the patio door with a glass of wine, looking out at the string lights through the glass. The room had rearranged itself behind us, clusters of people forming and dissolving around the bar, the noise level rising as the timer anxiety faded and everyone settled into the looser rhythm of a party. She was separate from it, standing where the air from the cracked patio door cooled the back of her neck, and she looked peaceful in a way that made me want to stand next to her and not say anything. I walked over and she turned when she heard me, and she smiled. That same steady smile from table 7. She told me she'd been wondering if I'd find her and how she said it made it sound like she'd already known I would, like it was a fact she'd been waiting to confirm. I told her I'd been looking since the bell rang, and I said it without thinking about whether it was too much or too soon, because something about the way she listened made honesty feel easier than performing. We talked without the timer pressing against the edges of every sentence. She told me about her first garden, the one she'd built at her own house after the divorce, how it took her 3 years and she ripped it out twice before it was right. She said the first time she'd tried to copy something from a magazine and the plants died in the first summer because they weren't right for the soil. The second time she listened to the yard instead of the magazine. Let the shade and the slope and the drainage tell her what belonged where, and everything grew. I told her about the cherry table, the one I'd been stuck on for a week. The top was done, sanded smooth, the grain running clean from end to end, but the legs weren't right and I couldn't figure out why. I'd cut 2 sets already and neither one fit the weight of the top, and I'd been sitting in the shop staring at it every evening trying to hear what it wanted. She laughed when I said that, a real laugh, short and low, the kind that comes out before someone can stop it. And she said that was the most ridiculous and truest thing she'd heard all night. I watched the contrast between her and the rest of the room while we talked. Behind us, a man in a suit was doing an impression of something for a group of women who laughed on cue. And near the bar, a woman was showing someone photos on her phone while he looked at the door. The whole room was performing, trying on versions of themselves like coats they weren't sure fit. And Eleanor and I were just standing by the patio door talking about wood and dirt and the things that take time to grow right. She asked me if I was going to mark her on my scorecard, and I told her I already had, in the first 30 seconds at table 7, before she'd even said her name. She looked at me for a long moment after I said it, her eyes steady and dark, and I couldn't tell if she was surprised or just letting the words land how she let everything land, without rushing to respond. Then she smiled again, smaller this time, just at the corners, and said she had marked me too, and that she didn't mark people often. The host announced that scorecards were due at the front table, and the room started to thin as people turned them in and gathered their things. Eleanor pulled hers from her purse and walked it to the front table, and I watched her slide it across with her hand covering the top half so I couldn't see what she'd written. She turned back to me with a small, private smile that I couldn't read, and I handed mine in beside hers, and the host stacked them together without looking at either one. We were the last 2 in the private room. The candles had burned down to stubs, and someone from the restaurant had started stacking chairs on the tables in the main dining room, the legs pointing up at the ceiling like a forest of inverted trees. The air still smelled like candles and wine, but fainter now, the scent of an evening winding down. Eleanor told me she didn't do things like this, go to events where people sat across from each other for 3 minutes and decided if they were worth more time. A friend had talked her into it, she said, the same way Marcus had talked me into it. I told her about Marcus and his thumbs up and his certainty, and she laughed again. That same short, low laugh, and said the world would be a quieter place if it weren't for friends who meant well. We walked outside together. The night air was cool and smelled like the end of summer, that last warm breath before the season turns. The string lights on the patio were still on, and they threw small circles of gold on the sidewalk at our feet. We stood there for a moment, not walking toward the parking lot, not saying goodbye, just standing on the sidewalk in the quiet that comes after a room full of noise. I asked her if I could take her to dinner sometime, and I said it the way I say things, plain and direct, without wrapping it in cleverness or hedging. She said yes, without hesitating, the same way she'd said everything else all night, like the answer had been there before the question and didn't need any time to find its way out. She pulled a pen from her purse and wrote her number on the back of my scorecard, the one I'd already turned in. And I laughed because now I had to go ask the host to give it back. She walked to the parking lot behind the restaurant, and I watched her go. Her truck was a beat-up Ford with a Garden Design Company logo on the door and mud on the wheel wells, and it looked like a truck that had been to 100 job sites and back. She climbed in, started the engine, and the headlights swept across the lot as she pulled out. She didn't wave or look back, just drove the way she did everything, steady and sure of where she was going. I drove home with her number in my pocket and sat on the porch in the dark, thinking about the difference between being needed and being chosen. I don't know what happens next, but for the first time in a long time, I want to find out if this story stayed with you. There are more quiet nights at the Spare Room Stories. Pull up a chair. It's quiet here.